like I described what supply chain is, you'd be surprised how often contracting gets involved, because they want to see the contract for, and they will say, we're going to audit 10 contracts. And so they have a good idea of what contracts they might like to audit. So it can go towards anything. They also might want to look at accounts payable. Like if you have an internal audit by the state or something, they might want to do a complete audit from when you bought it to when you paid for it and that sort of thing.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we are going to be speaking with Barbara Strain, principal at Barbara Strain Consulting in Hayes. Today's conversation, kind of a dreaded topic for some people. It's regulatory and accrediting bodies, the folks that are going to come in and do audits and surveys. Everybody knows that survey window, but in some cases, they come in unannounced. Maybe they're responding to a complaint. Maybe there's something in the industry that's going on and they need to get a little bit better feel on what's going on out there. Those things do come up. How can you be survey ready? We're going to learn all about it today. Hayes.
And Barbara always brings it. She's been around this industry for a little bit, and she's been in all different areas of a hospital. So she actually has a really good perspective of it, and I learned a lot. So come and join us, and you'll enjoy it today. I guarantee it.
All right, we're going to be right back. Barbara Strain up next on Power Supply.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
We are speaking with Barbara Strain, principal at Barbara Strain Consulting, and today's topic is going to be something that I don't think you really hear all that much about in supply chain, at least not when you look at content that is out there educationally. And we're going to be talking about accreditation surveys and regulatory audits, inspections. And I'd say the clinical leaders, you hear about it all the time in their departments, but we're not just talking about supply chain's role in supporting those departments, but actually internal to the supply chain. Barbara, thank you for being willing to come on and share your insights on this topic with us today.
Well, hopefully people aren't yawning already because, you know, all the regulatory and stuff, they're going, what? Usually there's a hot topic here. What's going on?
They'll do that when Gary begins to talk.
That's why we bring the humor on this show. We can tackle any topic, Barbara, but I will say this, your energy and your passion is going to keep people engaged as we walk through some of this, because you're right. It's not the most fun topic. It's definitely one of the most uncomfortable situations to be in, whether you're in supply chain or anywhere in healthcare. You know, there's a big fear associated with these audits and surveys in many cases, but it's also an opportunity for improvement. So we're going to frame this up today. Can you tell everybody about your background? Because you have a very interesting background, and I want to know how we get from the beginning to where you are today and your experience and value analysis.
I don't know if we have enough time, but it's, it's like they used to say, it all started in a 5,000 watt radio show. Anyway, so I started out as a clinical scientist, a microbiologist, a medical technologist way back in the day. And that's how I got my start in hospitals and things. So in California, you have to go through 4 years of college, a year of training, all that sort of thing. And so I was very inquisitive about everything. I still asked why about 5,000 times and things. And I did that for about 20 years of my career. I've worked at a couple of different provider organizations. And then when something came along, when we had an opportunity to develop our whole supply chain program that included some sort of a clinical person to do value analysis. So I threw my hat in the ring and got the job. So I was a department of one for many years figuring all that out. But I was always very in tune with supply chain measures, because we always had to order products. So we needed to have great dates and all that kind of stuff. I was the GPO whisperer for the lab. I was a lab safety officer. So I had a lot of different experience in doing lots of different things. But mostly when you're doing any sort of clinical work, you make relationships. And so that's what they were looking for as well. So then I actually retired, of which my husband does this. You retired because I still work. I make my own schedule, do what I want to do, but I go to meetings, I do podcasts myself, I moderate, I have clients, both providers and suppliers. So I have a fun life. Really.
By the way, she said quotes, like air quotes, when she said
I did air quotes.
Yeah.
Sorry, if you're never going to see them, I did air quotes.
Exactly.
Tell us about the podcasting. I mean, obviously we have that in common. Would love to hear about that.
Yeah, well, you might remember something in 2020 called the pandemic, and it was around April of the pandemic. So we were just right in the height of it. And at the time, I was doing a lot of work with AVAP, Association of Healthcare Value Analysis Professionals, which I'm a founding member, a past president, been on lots of committees. And I volunteered. I said, I think what audiences need in whether it's value analysis or supply chain or whatever, they need to be talking to each other, hearing what's going on real time and having as much help as possible. So I said, how about if I started a podcast series, which we did several times a week for the first 4 or 5 months. And then I cut it back to kind of twice a week and things, but it was short. We have things called the pandemic series. And then I did transition that to value analysis right now. So it's really short, but I have a few guests sometimes. Sometimes I'm the guest. And so with my micro background and infection prevention and control and things, we talked about everything they needed to know about antigens and antibodies and then a variety of stuff. And everybody felt connected and they could talk to each other. So they got practices. What is everybody doing about this and that so that they could keep up to date?
Well, it is a lot of fun to do, but it is also time consuming sometimes. And so, what better use of your time when you're trying to communicate in a new way when everybody's busy? Super smart, and way to be on the front end of that and just jumping right into it. I think that's phenomenal. So let's get into regulatory and accreditation, the surveys, the inspections, all these different things. And let's start with, I even kind of teed it up already by saying a lot of times you're just thinking about, the departments and the different areas of a healthcare organization that these surveyors and auditors are going to be going into, and sort of they're the ones that feel the brunt of it. But how involved is supply chain in this whole process? Not only, the supporting departments, but even more so intrinsically for their own department.
Right. So supply chain, and I always like to kind of define what supply chain is, because if you got what my administrator who was my mentor said, supply chain is a whole variety of things. So you should have contracting and purchasing, sometimes accounts payable, but you got the docks and you've got the, units upstairs and a variety of things. So you have to know and understand who's going to be inspecting you and what part of all those questions and where they're going to go are going to apply to you. So there's everything from local and regional, state, national, sometimes international, but you're going to have so many different types of inspections that are going to be going on. Sometimes they're, hi, I'm an inspector and I'm here today and I'm checking on X, Y, and Z. Sometimes the FDA would show up in someone's office and say, you need to go talk to Barbara Strain, or you need to go talk to so-and-so, and the FDA would come in and sit in a chair opposite my desk and want to know something about a recall, or how did you document or do something. So you always had to be prepared. But knowing what those are really, really important. Not only do you need to know all of the professional organizations like respiratory and cardiology and nursing and biomed and pharmacy and everybody else that's going to be inspected, there's some aspect of storage and receiving of supplies and all kinds of things that you need to know in supply chain. And then how do you communicate those down? So it's a lot to know, including magnet. I mean, there's just a variety of things. There's lab organizations. There's blood banks. So
do you think the knowledge Well, do you think the knowledge required of supply chain in this is greater than it is for any other sort of, I hate to say that they're siloed, but departments are somewhat siloed in a way. Do you think it's more daunting for supply chain? Because in so many facets of this, they really can't be siloed because they touch everything.
Well, right. You touch everything, just like, between value analysis, supply chain, and a few others, we'd all get these interesting phone calls because people would say, I'm not sure where to get this information, but I'll call supply chain because they'll know. And usually 99% of the time we would know either the answer or who to call or whatever, because you got to stay so connected to all of the key folks in your organization that coordinate all these things. So there's got to be threads that kind of sew everything together, because when nursing or any of those other departments get to a question from the inspector that's going around and they ask them a question, they say, oh, well, that's something that supply chain does for us. And then they go, oh, okay. Because what they do so much these days are what's called tracer. So they just don't go through a series of questions and ask you them in order or whatever. They'll say, we have a scenario. So we have access, this is the inspector talking, to different patients that we've had people pull. So we want to go through everything from where that patient first entered, say it was the ED, and went all the way through their whole sort of arc of being in the hospital or whatever. And along that line, there's a lab report, or there's a piece of equipment that might have been recalled. How did it get handled? Or there was documentation of a tissue and how did it come in, and did you record the temperatures? So it can go from department to department to department to department. And you don't know when they're going to come and call on you just for tracers and things.
So there is no set time when they show up, unlike like Joint Commission might tell you, but you're saying on some of these audits, they just occur?
They might tell you something maybe the day before. They might contact the regulatory or the quality office or whatever and say, by the way, we'll be there at 8:00. And because we got a complaint or we got a notice about something, or we're coming to follow up on something that we discovered sort of nationally and we're checking up on things or whatever. And so, scramble. So they're coming. I managed microbiology laboratory, and my whole thing was you plan for your inspection every single day you work. You work no differently than if you're going to be inspected.
Survey readiness.
Survey readiness. So if you're following everything, you're not panicking or anything you're talking about what you do every single day.
Well, that's assuming that you work at a very good place. Otherwise, there probably is some panic. But obviously, during the last, 3 years, like to your point earlier, we did have a pandemic. Obviously, that changed the call schedule, the audits, and those type of things. So what does it look like now after kind of the pandemic? How is all that working now?
Well, you're right. They did say there's no way we're going to come inspect folks while their hair is on fire, right? So they started back up again, but they also had to look at their checklist and their safety and quality and questions and things and maybe update what some of those look like. In the Joint Commission, there was always a section about how many days of supplies you should have on hand in case all your supply outlets are kind of cut off or something, like there was a flood or whatever, which we've been through lots of those things, or, a crash on the highway and they can't get trucks to you or whatever it is. Well, that was a short amount of time that was in there. Like, could you sustain for 4 days without any supplies or whatever? Well, we had to sustain for a long period of time. And even today, some of those disruptions are even more detrimental than the ones that we had during the pandemic. So there's a lot more of the resiliency and those sorts of things that are in there. But also when you were doing some things with, say, masks, and they had protocols for how to reuse those N95 masks. They kind of have gone away from that. So they might want to say, what are you doing today? Or how did you resolve that? So there's got to be things in place on how did you do things differently or better, and what did you adopt, and those sorts of things.
Barbara, I like the word you used earlier, scramble, because I've seen it. It's like we're at DEFCON 5, surveyors are here, we're going to have questions. And I remember back in the day being pinged, we had an hour to go find a PM, a document, like go find the PM on the MRI machine and when it was done. And it was like, go get it, go bring us proof, go contact the vendor one way or another, if it was Biomed or the OEM. But what you've seen, I'd like to know and share with our listeners is best practices of who are the key people from supply chain that they're reaching out to at a critical access hospital, an academic institution. Who are those people they're reaching out to?
So, like I described what supply chain is, you'd be surprised how often contracting gets involved, because they want to see the contract for, and they will say, we're going to audit 10 contracts. And so they have a good idea of what contracts they might like to audit. So it can go towards anything. They also might want to look at accounts payable. Like if you have an internal audit by the state or something, they might want to do a complete audit from when you bought it to when you paid for it and that sort of thing. So it depends. It also depends on how many of those other services does supply chain have. They can have linen. They can have the mail room. They can have food service. They can have patient transportation. Who knows? So you've got to have all of these things at your fingertips. So usually there is the supervisor, manager, director sort of level, because everybody calls something different. The vice president of supply chain or something like that make sure that things are in place, but the people that actually are closest to the work are the ones that keep the documentation, know where it is, back in the day when you had these big binders, and you'd haul them out and you'd have to go take them to the room where the inspectors were. Then you started scanning and putting things on, now pretty much everything is at your fingertips. But first of all, you would hope that the PM was done to begin with, and then you wouldn't have to go, oh, geez. But those are the first frontline sort of folks. But nowadays, between the tracers and everything else, anyone in that work area that's doing work that day may be asked. Like if you had to go to your policy for, safe handling of this package that came in, do you know where to find that? Have you been trained in that? What's your orientation like? So it can go all the way around the horn. To answer your question a little differently, if you don't mind, is you also have to know, besides the key people in supply chain, I would need to know, a biomed has those records. They have their own software, and those records are put into their software. So it's not that you're always deflecting to someone else, but you want documents and processes in the hands of the best people in the organization, that's their main thing. They know it. So don't try to do it all yourself, but meet with those folks and say, okay, we have X number of pieces of equipment. It's made sure that it's loaded in the biomed software. And then the schedules and when was it done and all that sort of thing. But you have to, verify that that's also being done.
That was a huge focus for Joint Commission, was that documentation around preventive maintenance. And it's not that they don't come back to those things, but it's interesting how they have certain trends around things that they're going to be focusing on.
Yes, they do have trends.
What are some of the trends of things that you're seeing maybe over the last year or so, and what you might be hearing about some emerging trends of things that they're going to be focusing on, that just making sure everybody out there doesn't have a blind spot for the next survey, et cetera, that may be coming? And obviously I'd be remiss if I didn't mention DNV, because we've seen a lot of healthcare organizations, getting accredited through DNV as well.
And they're slightly different organizations, but basically the bottom line is you pass, and then you're able to charge Medicare and things again, which is a good thing. But they haven't let go of the endoscope thing. Endoscopes, and how they were processed, how they were moved through system. How did you know they were actually, clean and things? Those are still hit up hard, because a lot of people, it took a lot of time to actually get organized when they were really focused on that. There is ethylene oxide is really out in the news now, and most folks have done away with it, but there are still processes that you have to use it for, because the manufacturers of specific products haven't figured out a different method of sterilizing or cleaning something or doing that final terminal clean without ethylene oxide or other gases and things like that. So there's just a lot of different focus on processes, usually revolving either sterile processing or some other larger things like that really affect the patients. Just before I retired, which was 4 years ago, about 2 weeks ago, we had been inspected. Yeah, who keeps track? Been inspected, but it was all about the humidity and the temperature of storage. And so, you have this big warehouse and you should be monitoring that sort of thing. but where was it recorded and everything else? And so
yeah, because it's on the packaging, right? Like even single-use supplies, there's storage requirements that's even on the packaging built around those guidelines.
But then you might pick up something that's given to you by sterile processing to put in bins, and so you get a whole bunch of it from them. Now it's already sterilized internally. What do you do with that and stuff? And so you had to learn about all of the fire prevention things, but you had to learn with facilities, was this building built in 2010? And if it was built in 2010, then you have to go by that building sort of code of how it was built and what were the things that were put in it versus was it built before 2000? Was it built after 2000? So you have to also learn all those things. And because some things might have automatically been built in, or they're monitored, off-site by special sensors, or they might be so old that you've got to adopt a building and adapt all the different things in there. How are you going to make that? Or that building may not be suitable at all, and now you're going to have to move some operations and things. So it can be pretty tricky.
Let's walk through some best practices. And I think the first one is nobody likes to be approached by an auditor or a surveyor, right? Because they're immediately under the gun and in the spotlight. Exactly. So, and we do try to speak to people at all different levels, of the organization. So there's some people that are going to be listening to this and going to say, yep, I remember the first time that I got approached, and maybe that's a long time ago now, and they're not really afraid of it because they know how to handle that situation, especially the I don't know situation, which is what I think most people, especially earlier with less experience, are the most concerned about, because sometimes we feel a lot of pressure to have the answer to everything. And it's not reasonable. And you just set the whole table at the beginning of this episode about you have to know so much and you touch so many different things. So all of a sudden, the possibilities of what you might be asked is pretty broad and intimidating. So what's the best way for folks out there, especially the newer ones in their career, to handle that situation when they're approached?
Well, sort of like it's a chicken and egg thing, right? Because how are they learning about all of these things? And we can get into that at some point, but let's just talk about your particular question. Is you answer yes, no, or I don't know, and I'll find out. If you answer yes or no, don't then start going into a whole explanation of why the yes might be yes or the no might be no, because then you're going to lead into other questions are going to ask. So if somebody said, do you have a process in place for assuring that packages are being delivered to the right location? Just something simple. You say yes, but you don't say, yes, we blah, 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 blah. Because maybe all of those things that you just said, one of them goes, I'm not quite sure that's doing it. And then they go, well, tell me more about that. And then pretty soon it leads to, well, we're going to have to go to every storeroom up on the nursing units because we're not sure that may have been handled correctly. Something like that. So you want to say, do you have a policy, blah, 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 blah? You say yes. Now, if they say, could we see it? Then you go, yes. And then you either pull it up, print it, or however they want to see it, right?
Barbara, that reminds me of like someone you watch on Dateline and they're on the stand, and you answer the question as concisely as possible. That would be your advice, sounds like.
You really do. And no can be just as interesting, if they say, do you have a policy for it? And you say no. And then they go, well, do you handle blah, blah, blah? And then you say, no, we don't handle those sorts of packages here. And then they could say, well, do you know where those packages are and things like that. So it's yes and no. And then the I don't knows are the difficult ones because people can kind of panic a little bit and then they go after, I knew the answer to that. Why didn't I say it? But they'll say, I don't know. And they go, well, who would you ask if you didn't know or where would you go to find that? So you should know who your, next report is that you should ask or
is it advisable to just say, oh, let's go ask my supervisor? I absolutely know that I was trained on that. I've been educated on it, but at this current time, I don't do a lot with it. So I would go to my supervisor or go to our policies to find that out.
Yeah,
so almost like
something.
act out what you would do if they weren't there.
Right. Yeah. It's like if you got confronted with that particular issue at work, what would you go do to work it out? Right. Oh, I've got some policies here. Well, let's go. I would go over here and it's, in here and that sort of thing. But you got to be very confident when you're doing that. But yeah, you could say, I would ask my supervisor or I would tell my supervisor and then they would advise me.
Barbara, I have another question and with the pandemic also kicking in with the more regulatory, like vendor credentialing, I want to ask you a question about vendors in this as supporting supply chain, because that whole piece of checking in where you're going to the OR, going to a floor, or even going to a non-acute care clinic for pharmaceuticals. Do they need to be ready on understanding that if they're down in the OR, they've got to understand PASS, they got to understand RACE? How much are our vendors going to be needing to understand Joint Commission when they're on premise, please? Because it falls under supply chain's purview a lot of times.
Yeah. So 2 things might happen, right? One is the inspector may not know that they're a vendor and ask them a question. So the person doesn't just go, hey, I'm a vendor, but you're in the environment, right? But yeah, PASS and RACE. I was actually the lead of our fire committee for our health system for 10 years. So PASS, RACE, all that kind of stuff. But in the credentialing stuff, there is information, plus there's signage and things. So we would do an orientation with vendors in that space. So they need to help themselves by answering certain questions because you need to know what different, codes might mean. You need to know what alarms and anything else might mean.
Overhead pages on the codes, correct. Yep, all day long.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you need to know to get out of the way if you happen to be in that area or whatever. But don't want to just pitch in and help because you're not trained to do that. But yeah, good question.
Hey.
Oh, we got a good question.
Gary finally got a good question.
Yeah,
that's good. I mean, we've been doing this for about 1.5 years. Congratulations, Gary.
Hey, that's so wrong.
I'm going for...
He walks his talk and all that kind of stuff. So he knows.
All right, I have 2 questions left. I know one of them is going to be a great question.
I'm sure it will be.
Because you're a mentor. Because you're a mentor.
The inside.
She'll say that's a legendary question.
A ton of these conversations are really only applicable to our past guests who have been behind the scenes. It's hilarious. So, Barbara, you're now indoctrinated. You're into power supply culture. All right, one question is, I think one of the infuriating things for me about the way that the response to surveys is that this is usually what initiates process improvements that maybe should have been identified ahead of time, right? Like, or they've been identified, but we don't act on them until somebody finally comes and slaps us on the back of the hand, right? So why is that? Is it because they carry so much weight with the consequences of, having findings or being cited?
Well, let's back that question up just a little bit because every question is interpretable. And so there might be one key word in a sentence that might be may or should or something, and you interpret it as, well, it doesn't mean I have to do it, maybe I should, or I might look at it. So it depends on how it's being interpreted. And sometimes, and I'll tell you, I'm going to defer a little bit here, and then I'll get back to really answering the question, if you don't mind.
It wasn't a good question. I think that's what she's trying to say.
Well, no, it was a good question because now I get to talk about lots of different things.
Okay, good.
But we had this thing called Fridays Before 5, where all the directors and managers and up would get together about 10 o'clock in the morning on a Friday, and we'd have a topic from one of the inspections for Joint Commission or FDA or something like that. And we'd focus on that. We get a little training, and then we already had teams assigned. So you'd never go to your own area. So we might have a team of 6 people or so, about 50 of these little teams, and we'd scatter and go all over. And you'd be assigned and say, you're going to go to 5 North, or you're going to go to the oncology clinic or whatever. And you'd have a series of questions that were the real sort of questions or similar questions. And you'd go up to any staff member and ask them and things. So it's all in that sort of preparation so that it's interpreted in a better way. So if you would look through records, and maybe there are temperature records or logs of QC or anything that was done and it was there, how come you didn't document this? Oh, well, no one said we had to. It just said to do X. So like you said, it's all in the interpretation. That's one thing. So you kind of have to get on the same page of interpreting. The next thing is that you do learn from these things. And so you think you've done a really good job of that particular thing, training people and things, but the inspector also has their own interpretation. So we would have these conversations with our own regulatory folks, and we kind of pull them aside and say, we've been doing this like this. We've had this process in place. This is the first time anyone's called it out. And so they would kind of talk to the inspector later, because they all have these conversations with the inspectors. There's little groups that talk and say, we found this, and what about this and that? And sometimes they would come back and say, well, we just got that out of the way. You really don't have to change anything. It was just something we saw somewhere else that was really a good practice. But because it works here and because of you don't have to change. And then the third thing is, okay, we've gotten called on it. We were working on this, but things got in the way and we just never got to it. But what inspections are supposed to be is you're supposed to learn from them. And every one of those inspections are always a learning opportunity. So don't take them as like punishment or I got slapped on the hand or whatever. But you have to know that within so many days or so many weeks, you've got to update something and you've got to show progress towards it. And then you've got to put things in place. Because you, as the manager of, 50 people or something, they're going to moan and groan. Why do we have to change how we do this? Why do we have to learn? So you don't want to make excuses and things. It's every opportunity to have a better practice is going to mean you're not working as hard. You're working better. And it's going to produce something.
All right, Barbara, I think that is really the most important kind of piece of it, right? It's a learning opportunity. How we approach this, our attitude towards it has a lot to do with how it goes, how we respond to it internally as a team and come together. And I also think it's important, that last piece, it's almost intentional by the surveyors and auditors that it be an opportunity for improvement. So they're always trying to advance healthcare, I guess, on some level in the way that's why they find new stones to turn over.
Yeah. And, we've talked about this as being, oh my, I got an inspection, I've got an audit. There are more proud faces that I've seen during inspections from staff and other folks is because they feel confident that they do really good work. And so they should feel good about all that and not feel like, oh my God, there are sometimes when inspectors come, you're proud, you want to, do really well, but it winds up being really painless at some point. It just depends on what part of that sort of curve you're in, and have you really paid attention to what are the new things? What are things that used to be, well, where I worked, or I worked in a position and this is what was happening then. So I'm going back to something I hadn't gotten back to yet, is you have to know and be part of various committees, and how do you maintain connections into your compliance, but other committees and things, your safety committees, your emergency management committees, all of those, so you can stay current, so that you're not in something that you might have done 8 years ago and now you've moved and you've got a different job, and how are things being handled and things. And I always think too is whether it's internal and you're going after promotions or you're moving and going somewhere else, when you're interviewing for a job or a promotion, you should be asking questions about, how do I stay up to date on things like compliance and regulatory, and what's the way in which I'm being helped to make sure that I'm going to be successful in my role.
Well, Barbara, hopefully you had some fun with us today.
I did, yes. And you can tell I'm kind of a boring person. I'm a very nerdy person when it comes down to it. I enjoy all these things because you got to juggle so many balls in the air. You have to know whether I put something on the floor? Do I have to put it on? So it was always fun, and we'd always play games about it and stuff, and that we'd all give each other a bad time. But I think it's just really important and part of the whole picture of being part of a professional organization and a profession. And supply chain is very, very key.
100% it is. Absolutely. Thank you, Barbara. This has been fantastic.
I have lots of fun.
All right, Barbara Strain, principal at Barbara Strain Consulting, joined us for this interview. Gary, we were talking about regulatory and accreditation responsibilities for supply chain. And, I think it's a great point that she made. We just touched so many different areas within the healthcare organization. You have to know so many different things, but it's that whole survey readiness attitude of participating in committees, staying connected with the people that you kind of need to know when these surveys come up, and the information and the relationships that you need to have continual access to is going to help set you up for success. And, you may not be somebody who necessarily needs to be involved in the committees. Maybe you're, a little bit newer to the supply chain and your role in healthcare. But even in that scenario, I think just speaking concisely and confidently, yes, no, or let me go find the person who knows, is a pretty safe place to be.
No, Justin, you're right on. Barbara had a wide range of knowledge in this category, and it is a integral part of keeping our hospitals open, supporting the mission, supporting our patients, supporting our staff, making sure we're all on board, and just being ready to go get that, to your point, just being ready, and supply chain at the table. Once again, we're more at that C-suite table and knowing where to get it as we have more hats and more umbrellas of what we're held accountable to, especially post-pandemic, and just really, really thoughtful consideration and direction from Barbara today. Great conversation on Power Supply today.
All right, that's it for this episode. Great discussion. And I do want to remind everybody to find us and follow us on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook. Download the smartphone app for iPhone or Android. Get into the game, be part of the conversation, comment, like, share the posts out there if you learned something during any of our discussions, but particularly today. Definitely want to see that. And you can send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net as well if you want to connect with us. Also, Hayes, Gary, and myself all on LinkedIn, so just send us a connection request and we'll be happy to message back and forth as well. And on behalf of Hayes, Gary, and myself, thanks for listening to this episode of Power Supply.